Whenever I come and I listen to members being installed and people being baptized, that reminds me that we exist as a church. That's our mission, so that people would come to know Christ and to grow in faith. And I would really appreciate if we can continue sharing stories with one another, not only in the Sunday service, but in our community groups, and sharing with others about how God is working in our lives. I'm encouraged to see that. There is a universal call. Every human being experiences this, as Colin has shared already. And it is a call to live in this time gap between what we experience now in this moment and what is to come in the future. It is what theologians will call the period or the space between the already, what God has already done for us in Christ, and what is not yet experienced, what is to come. That we have already been saved in Jesus, we have already received forgiveness in Christ, that we have already received the inheritance, but not all things are completely restored and consummated and come to its fulfillment at the end. So we live between what we will call this space of uncomfortable grace, that we live in this space, what we will call living in the middle of our human experience, between what we experience now and what is to come at the end, the present moment and the future to come. So we live with all sorts of expectations. We live with aspirations. We live with a desire that there will be change in us for the future, that we hope that there will be change for things to get better in the future, whether it's in our work or in our careers or in our relationships or in our circumstances or the political climate or cultural renewal or personal change or spiritual formation, that we all long for this, for the future, if we're not necessarily experiencing that now. Or we might be experiencing some form of that, but we want there to be more in the future. So we're called to live in this difficult space, and we're called to wait in this difficult space. And of course, you and I know that we're not very good at waiting. We're really not good at waiting for that change to come. So James helps us to think about waiting in this way, how we need to wait, how we need to live in this middle. And he shows us how to do this in several ways. We need to wait, number one, with patience. We need to wait, number two, with steadfastness. And thirdly, we need to wait with purpose. The first is we need to wait with patience. Let's look here again in verses 7 through 10. Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains. You also be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Now, here the word patience is used 3 times in verses 7 through 8. And patience is a passive virtue in the sense that we need to wait. In that sense, the word patience can be understood as forbearance or long-suffering. Simply means that we need to suffer for an extended period of time with forbearing patience. And we also see here in verse 8, it says, establish your hearts. This can be translated as strengthen your hearts or to stand firm. And this is a little bit more active in the sense that we want to have some sort of a steely resolve. So patience, as we all know, right? We've heard this within our culture that patience is a virtue. It is a gospel quality. It is finding quietness in our hearts and rest in our souls, no matter how challenging the circumstances might be, that we are called to wait with patience. And it is facing the uncomfortable delay with forbearance and long suffering. Because sin causes us to focus on the moment and try to find solutions to our problems, whatever they might be. And here, when it talks about even giving the example of a farmer, that's in the context of people who were landowners who were abusing their power and all of the resources that they had and engaging in acts of injustice by withholding things that they were supposed to share. So we're called to be patient. And we're called to be patient, not just to sit there like we are if you go to a dentist appointment or a doctor's appointment. I went to one a couple of weeks ago, and so you go there. What happens? You sit there, and then you don't know when they're actually going to see you, right? You try to get there like 15 minutes before your appointment time so that you can get in right on time. But you know what happens? You're never seen on time, right? And so if my appointment's at 10, usually you get in there around 10:15, 10:20. And so what happens? They tell you not to use your mobile phones, so you just kind of sit there and you're wondering what I'm going to do. And then you start looking at some of the periodicals and magazines that are there on the table, and all of a sudden you're finding yourself reading a magazine you never read in your life. And so when we tend to think about waiting, that's kind of the image that we have. That's not the image that James wants us to have. It's not as though waiting is just a kind of letting a useless time just to vanish in front of your presence. You need to be patient. You just need to endure because that's just kind of part of life. No, that's not what James says. James says, be patient, therefore, brothers and sisters, until the coming of the Lord. It says here, see how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains. So he is saying that we are called to wait with patience in light of eternity. Not only here for this moment, but what we are experiencing, even our patient waiting, is a preparation for the future. If there's no such thing as forever, if there's no such thing as an eternity, if there's no such thing as of the promise of the blessings that will come in the future, then patience makes no sense to us. If there's no such a thing as gaining a reward for the future, then of course our posture should be that of what James told us not to do, is to engage in momentary hedonism. We saw that in chapter 4, where it says that we would engage in momentary passions and pleasures to try to suck out of life everything that we desire to have for our own pleasure and for our own passions. And James is saying you need to protect your heart against your tendency to what the ancients called in Latin incurvatus in se, that is, to be curved inwardly to yourself. That the tendency is to be curved, incurvatus, to be curved into our own passions and our own pleasures and our own hedonism. And James is saying, don't do that. Wait patiently with forever, with eternity in mind. Therefore, that is the power that will help you to be able to engage in delayed gratification. And so he tells us about an example of a farmer. Because, friends, the material relational pleasures that we want to have in this temporary life is not the only moment that we will have to try to gain satisfaction for our experience. People will use this expression, you only live once, so eat, drink, and be merry, and try to suck everything that you can out of this life. But the glorious eternal life of reward, the coming of the Lord, the early and late rains. The farmers, in this image, they understand that there will be a reward in the future. In an ancient, barren place such as this context, what we're finding here is that the farmers knew that there would be rain coming in the fall, probably October and November, and that there will be spring rain sometime in March and in April. So what happens is that once they plant the seeds, even though they can't see the fruit that is presented to them at that moment, they are waiting in expectation with this mindset that there will be something that will come in the future. So the struggle for the farmer is actually worth it. It is refining that individual. That person does not forget about the future, but they understand that these things have been given in order for them to be able to recognize that the waiting process in and of itself is for their own growth. Again, every other culture besides the culture that we're living in at this moment, which is the most individualistic culture ever in human history, but every other culture from every other place that you can imagine, that they live life dealing with pain, dealing with the struggles, dealing with the trials, dealing with the adversity, dealing with suffering, knowing that there was another world. So they were able to cope. They were able to understand how to deal with the difficulties of life. But only in our individualistic secular culture do we have difficulty with this. Because the Bible makes it very clear that joy is not the same thing as momentary happiness. Because that momentary happiness, the way the culture defines it, cannot coexist with suffering. Either you will be happy with no suffering, or you will suffer with no happiness. But we sang this earlier in one of the songs, that the beauty of the gospel is that we know that suffering can coexist with joy. Because our joy, our understanding of our relationship with God and our understanding of our relationship to ourselves and with other people, that is not determined by the circumstances that are around us. And every single person knows that we all deal with some level of pain, some level of disappointment, some level of hardness of life, some level of suffering in this world. One commentator points out this philosophy. He explains it this way. He says, a someday philosophy. And a someday philosophy will say something like this: someday I'll have employment, or I'll be in a career that will be better than what I'm experiencing at this moment. Someday I will be fit. Someday that I'm going to be able to afford the kind of things that I want to purchase, whether it's a home or any other material goods. Someday I'll be able to find somebody to be involved in an intimate relationship with. Someday I will be able to get all of my finances in order. Someday I might perhaps go back and to get more training and to study more. And this kind of someday philosophy is as he goes on to say, is like a therapeutic approach to dealing with the aspirations that we have about the future, which we're not really that sure about will actually happen. It is what he calls dealing with our dissatisfied hearts through disappointing days by trying to convince ourselves, oh, maybe someday, maybe sometime in the future, my life would get better. But look at what the psalmist says. The psalmist says in Psalm 27, he says, I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. That he understands that it's not just a future dream, but that he knows who he is, and the present investment that he's making for his life at this moment is based upon something that will be given to him in the future. And that's exactly what James is trying to tell us. That he tells us to be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth. The precious fruit of the earth is coming. And he's able to intentionally wait with patience for the early and the late rains. And then he goes on to talk about how that he will be able to establish his heart. It says here, this can be translated, establish your heart, or to stand firm, or to strengthen your heart. Because when you wait, or when I wait, again, we're not good at this. Again, we're not good at this because we live in a moment in history where if there's anything that we want right now, if there's some sort of solution that we're looking for whatever problems that you have right now, we can problem solve. that we can look it up, we can get the resources, we can get whatever sort of support that we need in order to provide a solution for what we're experiencing at this moment. And therefore, it cuts against God's desire for his people to learn how to wait. And so this waiting process that the Bible is calling us to engage in, it exposes the struggles that we have within our own hearts. Because we wonder, well, if I'm not experiencing right now, does this mean that God has abandoned me? Is God not for me? Does not God care about me? Does he not want to bless me? Why does he want me to continue to wait in this way? Without realizing that the waiting process is an indication that God is for us, and it is a sign of his faithfulness to us, not a sign of his unfaithfulness. And so we start listening to the wrong voices. We start listening to the wrong revelation. We start listening to all the wrong sources, which will tell us, well, God's not really for you. If he were for you, then he would be with you. He would help you to overcome these things. Why would he allow these things to happen? Those things which we will consider trials and suffering and adversity, why would he allow this in your life? And so James is saying what you need to do is that when you experience these things, that your heart is going to be prone to listening to the wrong voices. Therefore, establish your heart. Speak into your heart. Stand firm. Strengthen your heart. Speak the gospel into your heart. And as you wait, the temptation there again would be for you to not look to God, but to look inwardly, to look at your circumstances and to indicate that this is what's going on in your life. And therefore, it says here in verse 9, that our hearts will again be prone to grumbling against one another. Now, the word here, grumbling, as it talks about how we are grumbling against one another, I want you to know this, that there is no grumbling that is morally neutral. I understand that many of us, when we look at certain types of struggles or habits or idolatrous, sinful actions, that we take those things very seriously, and we ought to. Certain lusts that we have in our hearts. But when it comes to grumbling, I don't think we take this seriously enough. But I want you to know, there is no grumbling that we have with one another horizontally that isn't first an affront and a vertical grumbling to God. There is no neutral grumbling. There's no such thing as, oh, I'll grumble a little bit here and then complain a little bit here and be a little cranky over here, be a little irritable over here. And that's really not that big of a deal. I mean, my circumstances are difficult, so people need to understand, even God. But the Bible tells us that we ought not to grumble. It is quite possible, and this is a really frightening thought. It is quite possible, as we were earlier singing these great hymns before the throne of God, as we sing about the praises of singing the praises of God's faithfulness, it is quite possible for us to be engaged in corporate worship like this, and at the end of the day, later today, maybe sooner for some of you, and we grumble. So in one moment, we praise God for his faithfulness. And at another moment, at the end of the day, that our hearts are filled with grumbling that is never neutral. In essence, when you grumble, you're saying this to God, even though you might not realize it. I don't like the way my life is operating right now. The circumstances of my life, I don't like it. Why do I have to have the relational difficulty? Why do I have to have the stress of things that are uncertain? Or why do I need to face the adversity of financial insecurity? Or why do I have to worry about all the pressures from work? And so, why is this happening to me, God? In essence, when we're grumbling, we are saying, God, you're not doing a good job running my life. That's essentially what you're saying, even though we don't want to verbalize it, but that's exactly what we're saying. We're saying, in essence, God, I think I can run my life better. I think that there can be better outcome if I'm engaged in self-rule rather than submitting to your rule. And that is why the danger of grumbling is something that we need to guard our hearts against, and we need to wait with patience, because patience is essentially saying, God, I know what you've promised is good and it will come to pass. You've given me signs and glimpses of that glory now from what Christ has accomplished in my life. And I know at the very end, with the return of Christ, I know in the future that there will be early rains. I know that there will be fruit in my life, even though I am going through all of this. And this is the reason why you're calling me to wait with patience. Secondly, we need to wait with steadfastness. Look what it says here in verse 11. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. So it gives us an example from Job. It also talks about the prophets, how they were persecuted, and they went through a whole lot of suffering for speaking the word of truth to God's people who were following other gods. But here it talks about the steadfastness of what it means to wait upon the Lord. It's this firmness. It is a steely resolve, as I mentioned earlier, determination, courage, and a willful intention in saying that I will wait with steadfastness. It is a picture of how you will stand firm, that you don't want to be moved, even though things are coming at you. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever watched Sumo Wrestling. I'm not an expert on Sumo Wrestling. All I know is that you've got two men who are very, very large men in a little kind of contained space, right? So you're supposed to stay in the space. So the purpose of being involved in that activity is not like some of the other sports or athletic events where two people will go in there, and they're usually in there to bring physical harm to one another, and so if you get them into a headlock or something like that and cause them to submit or to knock them out or that sort of a thing, or win by decision. No, that's not the point of sumo wrestling. This is why it's so different. And don't be deceived in thinking just because they're large that they're not athletic. No, these are very, very capable athletic beings. And so what ends up happening is the point is you're supposed to knock the other person, that's kind of what they do, try to knock the other person outside of this ring. And the purpose there is for them to stand firm the best they can and to maintain their balance, to stay in the ring. And what James is telling us in this sense is that we need to remain steadfast. And as I mentioned this when I was preaching on this different passage earlier on in chapter 1, that the word steadfast is actually a military image. It's a military image of a soldier, even though there are enemies that are attacking that individual, that he is willing to remain steadfast, that he will hold his ground, that he will remain there. And then it gives us an example or an illustration of Job. Job waited, and he waited with steadfastness. He did not forsake the Lord. Yes, his waiting was not clean, and it wasn't completely sanctified. Yes, it was messy. He had to deal with lots of different doubts and struggles, and he had to deal with his insufferable friends. He had to deal with the sovereignty of God. He had to deal with all of these things. But you know what you find? As the story is progressing, you're actually wondering, is God going to give him answers to why he suffered in this way? Is he going to provide resolution for all of the stories that have not provided completion? In essence, when you grumble, you're saying this to God, even though you might not realize it. I don't like the way my life is operating right now. The circumstances of my life, I don't like it. Why do I have to have the relational difficulty? Why do I have to have the stress of things that are uncertain? Or why do I need to face the adversity of financial insecurity? Or why do I have to worry about all the pressures from work? And so, why is this happening to me, God? In essence, when we're grumbling, we are saying, God, you're not doing a good job running my life. That's essentially what you're saying, even though we don't want to verbalize it, but that's exactly what we're saying. We're saying, In essence, God, I think I can run my life better. I think that there can be better outcome if I'm engaged in self-rule rather than submitting to your rule. And that is why the danger of grumbling is something that we need to guard our hearts against. And we need to wait with patience, because patience is essentially saying, God, I know what you've promised is good and it will come to pass. You've given me signs and glimpses of that glory now from what Christ has accomplished in my life. And I know at the very end, with the return of Christ, I know in the future that there will be early rains. I know that there will be fruit in my life, even though I am going through all of this. And this is the reason why you're calling me to wait with patience. Secondly, we need to wait with steadfastness. Look what it says here in verse 11. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. So it gives us an example from Job. It also talks about the prophets, how they were persecuted, and they went through a whole lot of suffering for speaking the word of truth to God's people who were following other gods. But here it talks about the steadfastness of what it means to wait upon the Lord. It's this firmness. It is a steely resolve, as I mentioned earlier, a determination, courage, and a willful intention in saying that I will wait with steadfastness. It is a picture of how you will stand firm, that you don't want to be moved, even though things are coming at you. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever watched Sumo Wrestling. I'm not an expert on Sumo Wrestling. All I know is that you've got two men who are very, very large men in a little kind of contained space, right? So you're supposed to stay in the space. So the purpose of being involved in that activity is not like some of the other sports or athletic events where two people will go in there, and they're usually in there to bring physical harm to one another, and so if you get them into a headlock or something like that and cause them to submit or to knock them out or that sort of a thing, or win by decision. No, that's not the point of sumo wrestling. This is why it's so different. And then don't be deceived in thinking just because they're large that they're not athletic. No, these are very, very capable athletic beings. And so what ends up happening is the point is you're supposed to knock the other person, that's kind of what they do, try to knock the other person outside of this ring. And the purpose there is for them to stand firm the best they can and to maintain their balance, to stay in the ring. And what James is telling us in this sense is that we need to remain steadfast. And as I mentioned this when I was preaching on this a different passage earlier on in chapter 1, that the word steadfast is actually a military image. It's a military image of a soldier, even though there are enemies that are attacking that individual, that he is willing to remain steadfast, that he will hold his ground, that he will remain there. And then it gives us an example or an illustration of Job. Job waited, and he waited with steadfastness. He did not forsake the Lord. Yes, his waiting was not clean, and it wasn't completely sanctified. Yes, it was messy. He had to deal with lots of different doubts and struggles, and he had to deal with his insufferable friends. He had to deal with the sovereignty of God. He had to deal with all of these things. But you know what you find? As the story is progressing, you're actually wondering, is God going to give him answers to why he suffered in this way? Is he going to provide resolution for all of the stories that have not provided completion? Is he going to provide an answer to all of the doubts that Job had? And then at the end of his questioning, the end of all of the inquisitive kind of seeking out after God, this is what Job is able to say after God asks him multiple questions. And this is how he ultimately answers. Then Job, this is in Job 42. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. So Job is realizing, you know what? I don't need a resolution to all of the doubts and all of the questions that I had. I don't need you to answer. You're actually not obligated to answer why all of these things are happening in my life, because what I have found is not answers to my problems, but I have seen you with my own eyes. So what is a blessing, friends? Because what's going on here is that Job received the answer from God before he restored all things in his life. It's not as though the end of Job's story comes at the very end when God restores everything. And we look at that story and like, oh, okay, so God was able to kind of replenish all of the things that were taken away from him. No, I'm telling you that the real blessing happened before the replenishing. Because at this very moment, he's able to realize that the real blessing happened through a radical heart transformation. That Job was able to get to a point where he's saying, my life has changed. And this is what waiting does. Waiting with patience and waiting with steadfastness and waiting with standing firm, waiting with establishing our hearts, waiting with strengthening our hearts. This is what it does. It brings radical heart change in your life. Even though, as one commentator put it, we long for a mercy of release, even though we long for a mercy of relief, and again, I'm not suggesting that God will not do that for us. It depends on his wisdom, how he wants to grow us and sanctify us. But oftentimes he doesn't give to us the mercy of relief or the mercy of release because he cares for us, not because he's being unfaithful. Because what he wants us to experience during all of the hardships and all of the trials and all of the suffering and all of the setbacks and all of the disappointments is that he wants us to experience the mercy of refinement. He is refining us. And the only way that this can really happen in your life and in my life is for God, within his permissive will and within his permissive grace, to allow the trials, allow all of the difficulties, allow all of the challenges that he is allowing to happen in your life in order to sanctify you and to refine you and to help you to become complete and mature, what he said earlier. Because he's that committed to you. He's committed to seeing you completely sanctified. He is committed to seeing you to a place where you will be able to be driven to God. Not driven away from God, but driven to God. Because the Bible says that God is near the brokenhearted. He upholds all who fall and lifts up all who are bowed down. That he cares for all of those, all of his people who are suffering. And he wants to draw near to them. And in the darkest hour and in the most difficult, challenging moment, and some of you, even today, on an unhappy occasion, as we try to think about Mother's Day, some of you are hurting because some of you have lost mothers. Some of you have challenges with a relationship with your mother. You have all sorts of other relational challenges. And what God is trying to help us to remember is that God is still there. That in the darkest moments of our lives, God has not abandoned us, and we ought to seek him. As a matter of fact, during these moments, these are the moments where we need to stand firm. You know, when challenges come into your life, the temptation will be this: oh, God doesn't seem to be with me. Oh, I don't have a whole lot of support. Then you know what? I'm not going to seek him either. I'm not gonna pray. And why should I read the Bible? Why should I engage in corporate worship? Or why should I spend time with people at church? I mean, my life isn't really changing. Otherwise, he wouldn't allow these things to happen. And what James is trying to help us to remember is that these are the moments, especially in these moments, that we ought to remain steadfast, the way Job remained steadfast. for us to know in those darkest moments that God is still there. That we ought not to shirk all those things that God is asking us to think about. It is this theology of uncomfortable grace. But he's telling us this because, as I get to my last point, we need to wait with purpose. Let's look here in verse 11 again. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, that he is using trouble for some purpose. You can't see it right now. Of course you can't see it right now. You're wondering, what purpose could there be? What reason could there be for God to allow this to happen in my life? Again, if you could, then you will be self-sovereign. God is trying to say, you're not self-sovereign. I'm sovereign. I know what your future holds, and your future is good. I have promised that I will be with you. I have promised that you will get the rewards and the crown of life earlier on in chapter 1. I have promised that you will be fully sanctified, complete, and mature. And in order for you to get there, I need to allow this moment of uncomfortable grace. And that is the purpose, that you would remain steadfast, that the testing of all that's going on in your life will produce, what does it say in chapter 1? Steadfastness. So it's a grace of testing. It's a grace of purpose. It's not a picture of his inattention. It's a work of refinement. That God wants to use all of the challenges in my life in order to refine me. That means that not only do the blessings belong to God, but even our hardships belong to God. Even our challenges belong to God. Even our suffering belongs to God. And therefore, he is calling us to wait upon the Lord for the promises of future restoration. And the promise and the encouragement is that God is changing us to what he wants us to become. Through all of this, through the waiting, through the patience, through the steadfastness, through understanding why he allows us, through understanding the redemptive purpose of God, that we need to be reminded that he wants us to become what he wants us to become. You know, when we look at, in the book of Revelation, when the hosts of heaven focus their worship on the Son, who is the Lamb of God, it does not say that they're standing before the Lamb and worshiping and singing praises to the Lamb, but it says that they're worshiping and singing praises to the Lamb who was slain. I've always found that interesting. It doesn't just talk about the Lamb generally. It talks about the Lamb who was slain. Which means that ultimately, the greatest picture of how God will bring glory, even through his own Son, had to happen through the means of suffering. The suffering is useful. It is not useless. Don't waste your suffering, friends. Don't waste your hardships. Don't waste your trials. Don't waste all of the disappointment. Don't waste all of that, because God is saying that there is a useful purpose for why I have allowed these things to happen in your life. Just as there was a use for the suffering of my Son, who is the Lamb who was slain, and therefore he is exalted. And we sing words of praise and worship. The greatest suffering in history was at the center of all that God was doing. Therefore, suffering was a redemptive crucible for our own good. Some of you know that one of my favorite authors is Jonathan Haidt, who is a professor, a moral psychologist who teaches at NYU Stern School of Business. And some of you might be aware that he's written a book recently entitled The Coddling of the American Mind. I will highly endorse that book for you. I think it's one of the best objective critiques of our culture today. But the work that I'd like to reference today is one of his other best-selling books entitled The Happiness Hypothesis. The Happiness Hypothesis. And he goes on to say that there are benefits to trials and suffering. And he's speaking, he's not a Christian. He would call himself a nominal atheist who finds great benefits in being religious. And he talks about 3 benefits of suffering. Number 1, a person becomes more resilient. So again, even as we parent our children, don't try to create the safest environment for our children. Of course, we want to protect them from real harm, of course. I'm not suggesting that. Just kind of let them roam around and let them get eaten and devoured by all of the dangers that are out there, right? I'm talking about it's okay to let them play out there in the playground. If they fall and scrape their knee and eat a little bit of dirt, that's good for their life. It makes them more resilient. And second benefit of suffering, he goes on to say, is it strengthens relationships. Because you lean on other people, other friends and other family members, other people in the community, a church such as ours. And the third one here is very, very perceptive, and he's tapping into what we will call kind of ancient traditional wisdom. And he says suffering changes priorities and philosophies. There's nothing like suffering that will cause you to evaluate your priorities. You thought that this is my life and worldview. This is how I'm going to live my life. I'm going to pursue my personal achievements. I'm going to invest in all of these things, and I expect some sort of a return on the investments that I'm making. And there's nothing like suffering that will disappoint everything. Trials, hardships, setbacks. And if you live your life based upon that shallow worldview, then of course your life will crumble. But what Haidt is trying to say is that if you view suffering as useful and not useless, as a redemptive crucible for your own life change and sanctification, then it can completely reprioritize your current priorities and philosophies. And it'll force out a certain life agenda that you didn't even think that you were capable of pursuing. So he goes on to say trauma shatters belief systems and robs people of their sense of meaning. In doing so, it forces people to put the pieces back together, and often they do so by turning to God or some other higher principle as a unifying principle. There's no other agent in your life and in my life, whether you're a Christian or not, that will cause you to challenge your priorities like suffering and trials and adversity. You realize very quickly that you might perhaps be a shallow person when adversity hits you and your entire life falls apart. But if you are able to view all of these sanctifying agents that God allows into your life as being useful for your own growth, for your own inner, radical, inward, kind of interior heart change, then you're able to find joy even in the midst of all that. Now, let me make a parenthetical note. I'm not suggesting that the Bible is cold and hard when it comes to real suffering. James is not saying, you're going through some serious suffering. Hey, just get over it. Right? The Bible is not shallow in that regard. It is not trying to minimize your hurt, and some of you are hurting deeply. Certainly don't want to minimize that. But what James is trying to help you to see is that the purpose of God is for you to have steadfastness as your faith is being tested because you're being sanctified for His glory and for your good. So we look at Jesus on the cross through His own suffering, and people said, "Oh, poor thing." They just pitied Him and mocked Him and felt sorry for Him. Oh, He tried to save others but couldn't even save Himself. And therefore we say that suffering is useless. It had no purpose. But there was a purpose. That God didn't simply say that these things were happening without any reason. That is why when Jesus died on the cross and he rose from the dead, that the way that we view Jesus is different than the way we view other great men and women in history. We look at certain people like Gandhi and we respect him, but we look at Jesus and we worship him. There is the greatest redemptive value of the cross. If God can bring the greatest glory, power, purpose through the cross, in the midst of all the pain and the discomfort and the suffering, then of course he can bring purpose and glory and refinement and redemption through your own suffering and trials. So that is why he's telling us, wait with patience and steadfastness and with purpose. Friends, if there were anyone ever in history who had the right to be impatient and didn't want to wait for seeing all the grumbling and the complaining and the rebellion and all the sin and the injustices and all of that, and he could have just completely eradicated everything and brought judgment and done that, it was the person of God. But the reason why God is patient, the reason why he is long-suffering, the reason why he is forbearing, the reason why he is steadfast, the reason why he is resolute, the reason why he perseveres, the reason why he is this is because he realizes that we still need time in order for us to be sanctified. He still knows that we need time in order for the stubbornness of our hearts to turn not inwardly but outwardly, looking to God and to worshiping him, so that we will no longer grumble and praise in one moment, but our hearts will be opened up wide to be able to appreciate the goodness of our God, who is so faithful to see us to the very end, that he doesn't give up on us. Think about all of the relationships that we're involved in. We see some positive signs early on in the relationship. We're like, oh, hey, this person seems to be loyal. I'm committed to this person. And whether it's a friend or it's a husband or a wife or a parent or a child, we say, hey, this person's giving to me a lot more than I'm giving to that person. That person seems to be committed to me. But then what happens? When there's that moment when they turn on you, that moment when their hearts are bitter, in those moments when they are unforgiving, in those moments when they're not as loyal as you like for them to be, what happens? We cut them off. I don't have space for people like that. I can't endure and wait for you to be sanctified. Let someone else do that. I don't have that kind of margin in my life. I only need positive people in my life. If anyone's going to be negative and toxic, that will be me. But everyone else around me needs to be positive. How do you think that you'll be able to be patient with other people? You'll be patient with other people when you see the long suffering of our God. And when you see the perseverance of our God, the steadfastness of Jesus himself, who stood firm and who didn't give up on us, even when he was hanging there on the cross, when he said, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. He was that committed for you. And if he were that committed to you, then we are able to look at other relationships. We're able to look at even ourselves and to say, I can wait. When somebody asks you, how are you doing? Don't say, just hanging in there. But respond by saying, I'm enduring by the grace of God. I know that's a long phrase, but say, I'm enduring by the grace of God, and I'm waiting